Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live panel discussion about how to start 2022 the sustainable way, hosted by Yo Valley Organic and myself, Lizzie Rivera. The topic of climate change and sustainability can be overwhelming, and it can be difficult to know where to start. So, we're here today to begin to break it down and to talk about the small positive acts that can make a big difference to the planet, as well as our own health and well-being. Doesn't have to be a case of overhauling your entire life, but from what we buy to where we shop and how we spend our time, it all makes a difference. Our panel today has been brought together by Yo Valley Organic, the UK's largest dairy brand. Yo Valley Organic has been bringing dairy to our shopping baskets for over 25 years now, and their farm in Somerset is passionate about regenerative organic farming and the potential it has to help with our climate challenges. So, joining us today, we have Tom White, Yo Valley's very own soil health and regenerative farming expert, Lucy Williamson, award-winning nutritionist with a passion for gut health and real food, and Kalkidan Magessa, ethical and sustainable retail champion and founder of Schwab. Hopefully, we'll all learn more than just a few tips on the sustainable changes we can make to revitalise ourselves, to help rejuvenate our planet, and become part of the generation helping to combat climate change. So I'll kick us off with the first questions, and then we'll take yours from the audience. You can submit your questions in the Vimeo or on social media as you think of them as we're talking, and we'll get through as many of them as possible at the end. But let's begin by setting the scene. So sustainability means something slightly different to everyone. So can we start with each of you please explaining what sustainability means to you on a personal level? And Kalkidan, let's come to you first.
Thanks, Lizzie. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope everybody is well. So sustainability for me is very much around understanding how the choices I make, both as an individual and in business, affect the environment and the people with which I share, my local community and then my global community as well. So it includes everything from how I shop, to how I hire, to how we procure goods for our company, and very recently and most increasingly, what I'm finding is that I'm needing to understand how to measure the impact of our choices, so that our choices could hopefully be more green. And something which is personally very important to me is understanding that so much of the environment is protected by Indigenous peoples, and so much of the burden of climate change and climate emergency is carried by Indigenous peoples and people in the global south, of which is my background as well. And so I think sustainability is about global justice. If a more sustainable economy and community can be achieved, if we can learn to live in a way that's more environmentally sound, then we create a more equitable society as well. And I think that's super important, and I'm very passionate about it.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think that's a really great way to start. Thank you. And we'll speak more about that for sure today. Lucy, when it comes to the food that we're eating, what does sustainability mean to you?
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me here. So for me, the simple version is just to try and move away from convenience. If we can try and make our food choices, especially, but many of our choices more based around food in its more natural form, sourcing it so it still resembles the way it looked when it left the farm. That really is the key for overall health as well as gut health. And my work with a lot of farmers who are farming regeneratively and trying to help them communicate the health benefits of their food, it's all based around helping the public actually source this real food, which is just so nutrient rich, get away from the processed food. Really, if we can learn to find a toolkit to live like that, that is half the battle.
And can I ask, why is that so important? So why do we want our food to resemble the food that looks like from the farm rather than convenience food or ultra high processed foods?
So when I'm talking about convenience food, I'm just meaning food that's so easy. We all have really busy lives, and including me, and it's actually, it is hard to make these changes. But it's if we choose food that has been more processed, so it has a longer shelf life, it's more convenient, or perhaps it's ready made. The food has been the original food has been really altered. So if you look on a label, for example, of a plastic wrapped loaf of bread, just your ordinary sliced loaf, there will be many ingredients on that label that you can't recognize. Compare that with a loaf of sourdough, which is just wheat and water and a little bit of salt. And that's a really nice difference between the two. The less processed whole food is full of nutrients and not as much energy in it, whereas when we process our food, we actually remove a lot of the nutrients, and the food becomes more full of energy because it's got additives in it which make it more tasty for us. And so we end up with this imbalance of nutrients in our food, and ultimately our health is guided by what we're fueling ourselves with. There's many other factors as well, of course, but the more natural our food is, the better for our health.
Okay, brilliant. And that takes us really nicely to Tom, who's farming a lot of our food for us. Thank you. What does sustainability mean when it comes to farming?
Thanks, Lizzie. I think really for me it's become a kind of a dual discussion. Sustainability in the kind of conventional sense that we think about it, that we really need to reduce our reliance on non-renewable resources essentially, and reduce fossil fuel usage and extractive technologies and those kind of things. But it's kind of taken on a new meaning for us and for me now, around acknowledging the damage that's been done to our farming ecosystem over the last 200 years or so, as global warming particularly has increased. But so has biodiversity loss, and so has loss of topsoil and pollution. And I think ultimately, if you want to examine sustainability and think about what's really sustainable for us over the long term, we have to think about trying to regenerate those resources that we need. And what's really exciting, and so what sustainability is coming to mean for me, is that we have to work out how we regenerate our global ecosystem. And we have come to learn that many of the ways in which you look after land and soils and plants and animals can deliver those regenerations. So I think really ultimate sustainability needs us to look now at this, in the next few decades, at how we can regenerate the planetary ecosystem, in order to be sustainable over the long term.
Okay, brilliant. So it's no longer just about sustainability, which means essentially not having a negative impact, but we've now moved into an era where we need to regenerate, which means that we need to make sure that we're putting in more than we're taking out. So it's a much less extractive mindset, and we are farming in a way that encourages biodiversity on the farm, is good for animal welfare. And as you've mentioned, this all starts with the soil. Do we want to talk about the soil and why that's so important?
Yeah, I think regeneration and regenerative farming has a very broad definition. If you asked 100 people who are into the topic, you'd get 100 different answers. But one of the things which pretty much everyone agrees on is this need to look after soils, to regenerate soils. And I suppose the reason for that is because whilst people probably don't consider it most of the time, we're incredibly reliant on our soils. About 95% of our food comes directly from the soil. But more than just producing food for us, soil is able to deliver clean air and water for us, able to support biodiversity, and able to give us resilience as the climate changes, to be able to produce in the future as well. So to be able to withstand drought or to prevent flooding, all of these things can be affected by the way that we look after the soil, which is quite amazing.
It
And
is.
for us as organic farmers, it's quite rewarding, because this new framing of sustainability and regeneration kind of keys in very nicely with what we've been doing really for the last 20 years or so on this farm, but in the organic industry since the sort of 1940s, because many organic practices, the use of mixed farming and livestock to build natural soil facility, now we find are also the practices that we're going to need going forwards to regenerate.
Yeah, it's almost like we've taken the dirt beneath our feet as for granted over the last 50 years as farming has become more intensive, because we didn't perhaps tune into how important it is. But what's that amazing stat about in a teaspoon there's more?
In a teaspoon of healthy soil, there's more living organisms than there are people on the planet.
Yes, which is just incredible, really. Yeah. And Lucy, what does that mean in terms of the food that we're eating and in terms of gut health? And I'm assuming the healthier the soil is, the more nutrient rich the food is, but I don't know if that's been proven yet.
No, absolutely right. It's such an exciting understanding that we have now, that those microbes in the soil, they unlock the nutrients in the soil for the plants and the crops that are growing in that soil, so they can absorb the maximum nutrients and be plants and crops that are full of goodness, and of course also for the livestock that are then eating those plants. And the lovely analogy then is with our own gut health is that we ideally want to have about 100 trillion bacteria in our own gut, in our large intestine, and they're doing exactly the same thing. They're unlocking the nutrients in our food so that our body is then as healthy as it can be, because we're getting maximum nutrients from our food, but also that's nurturing those bacteria by the very natural food that we eat. And those bacteria give us many, many health benefits, which I know we'll go on to discuss. But it's a lovely way that our health can mirror a very natural approach to farming, and that biodiversity that Tom was talking about in farming, if we can bring that in to our own food choices as well, the two just work together brilliantly.
So it's really also about seeing us as part of a much bigger system, right? We just need to understand more how our health is completely linked to farm health, to our environment's health, which I do think, obviously, everyone here today that's listening, we're all starting to grasp that now. And obviously we have to unlock that for as many people as possible and make really good nutrient-rich food as accessible to as many people as possible as well. And Kalkidan, your speciality is fashion. Well, one of your areas of specialities is fashion. Does this link to fashion at all? Does regenerative agriculture or regeneration as an idea link to fashion?
Absolutely. So what people don't realise is that the fashion industry is having a huge impact on our climate. So from an agricultural perspective, 30% of agricultural land in the world is used to grow materials for clothing. And what that does, and because clothing, where it's produced largely, so cottons, bamboos, and other natural materials, because they're cash crops, export crops, what the vast production of them does is actually increases competition of land for growing food. So here we want to have nutrient-rich, diverse, healthy diets, but we also want that for people all over the world. But the sheer demand for fashion, and cheap fashion in particular, increases the competition for land for healthy food. And in addition to that, the majority of the things that are produced are never used. So the average person only wears about 1/3 of their wardrobe, a bit less than that for most people. And what that means is we're spending a lot of resources, a lot of fresh water, a lot of land producing things for them to be very, very quickly discarded. And so regenerative processes within the fashion industry would first be to grow things in a more sustainable way, so in organic ways, with fewer insecticides and pesticides, so that the soil can be healthier. But in addition to that, it would be for consumers to be thoughtful about what they purchase and where they purchase from, and the impact that's having on the supply chain, and whether they really understand how that top or t-shirt that they've picked up that maybe cost less than a cup of coffee, how it was made, and really how much use they're going to get from it in the long term as well. Because in that way, consumers can drive, a huge amount of change for, how much land is used to grow the material, how that
Absolutely.
material is grown, how healthy the environment will be as well.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. And that's a huge amount of information for someone to take in, especially if which we're not all experts on the fashion supply chain. So for the people watching today, how do I become a more sustainable shopper? Like, what do I look out for? And I think also importantly, how do I avoid greenwashing? Like, how do I know if a brand is being genuine when they're making wonderful sustainability claims?
Yeah, absolutely. So greenwashing is rife. Like a huge
Hmm.
example of this, I won't name the company, but a very large company released a campaign last year claiming that they were recycling clothes, so that you could give them clothes and they would circle them back and loop them back and produce new things, which is
Hmm.
amazing, right? What they failed to mention was this recycling was only happening in a hypothetical digital game, and it wasn't happening in real life. So there's a huge levels of greenwashing within the industry, and I think from a consumer perspective, there are simple answers and there are kind of more complex answers. I can't think of the analogy, but if it seems suspicious, it probably is. If there isn't
Yeah.
full information, it probably doesn't exist. But
Hmm.
actually, the simplest thing most consumers can do, the cheapest thing most consumers can do, is just really look at what they own.
Okay.
Ask themselves, are they really making the most of the things they've purchased before? What their relationship to shopping is, what their relationship to fashion is, and actually slow down a little bit. And I think that process helps people make more thoughtful choices when they do choose to shop in the future. It helps them
Yeah.
spend their money better. It helps them understand their style. It's full of reward. That's how they
Okay.
should go about it.
It's true. So kind of shop less and shop better, but you can still shop. Is the Yeah, brilliant. And that's obviously very similar to the foods message as well, which especially when it comes to meat is eat less and eat better. Lucy, is there anything, or Tom, that you two would like to add? So about tips for the people watching this on what they can do when they're making food choices.
Shall I go first, Tom? Just
Go for it.
so I think one easy thing to pop in your toolkit is just look at the labels. If there's ingredients on the labels that you don't recognise, then that food has been processed and it's not as natural as it could be for you, and the likelihood is it's far less nutrient rich. So when I mention that word nutrient rich, I mean vitamins and minerals like calcium and iron and all these wonderful vitamins and minerals that we need to keep us healthy, and antioxidants, which are basically an anti-aging nutrient that are in many fresh plants. There's all those wonderful rainbow coloured colours of the rainbow plants are packed of antioxidants. But check the label. It's just an easy way to work out whether that food is more natural, less processed, and also seasonal. Try and buy, if you're thinking about veg, try and buy it loose, so you're just buying what you need rather than buying it nicely wrapped in packaging, which probably means it's come far too far away, it's out of season. These are two perhaps quite practical ways. And the less and better meat is a lovely, if I can just mention really quickly, because I think half the problem with being able to make food choices is we can get so confused by what we read in the media, and what we read one week is completely opposite to what we read the next. And what we know, and this is me talking as a nutritionist, and I used to be a vet, so I have a very sort of scientific background to this, but as a mother as well with a practical approach. If we eat plant-based, which is brilliant, and it means we get a lot of fiber from our food, and that makes about 70% of the food that we eat, then that's a great way to eat. But that other 30%, depending on your personal needs, if you add in some animal protein into that, so it's still plants, but you're adding in less and better meat and dairy and fish, all those foods also have fantastically beneficial nutrients for us. And when they're being produced in a farming system that's farming in a way that sort of mirrors nature and is beneficial for so many of our environmental problems that we're struggling with at the moment, then, the whole system just works so well together.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And Tom, who is actually producing our food.
Well, those were really practical kind of approaches. So I'll be slightly more philosophical, and say, I'm trying to champion soil to all of you guys as what everybody needs to consider. And Lizzie, you kind of said quite aptly that we've treated soil a little bit like dirt in the last century, perhaps. And so I know this could go for food or for fiber. If you pick something up that you're about to purchase, perhaps just think about the soil that it very likely came from, wherever that is in the world, and think about yourself as part of that soil ecosystem and the global ecosystem, and think about whether that product is likely to have a positive impact and to be delivering all of the things I was telling you that soil can deliver, from carbon sequestration to biodiversity to nutrient density, as Lucy was saying, and how powerful it is to pick that one up or to support the producer who's working in one of those systems.
Yeah, and I think actually taking it onto a more philosophical path at the moment is a really nice reason, because we've spoken about what to do, but why do this? Is a question that I'd like to answer, which actually, Tom, you just touched on quite nicely. So buying food produced in this way does support farmers who are producing food in this way. That's great. It's better for our health. But what motivates you? I mean, each of you runs a business in which you prioritize ethics and sustainability, when you could very easily maybe prioritize profits and in this world and not run your business so ethically and sustainably. Why? What motivates you? What keeps you going? Who would like to take that question?
Well, I'll go first, because I think I certainly have grown up in a generation where we've been told pretty much our whole lives about the planetary problems that we have, the wicked problems, and perhaps this is the same for everybody. But having then studied sustainable or environmental science and moved into agriculture, I've gone through a number of different viewpoints on how food and farming particularly can influence these problems, from people who would demonize everything that we do in the livestock industry to foods that's produced in other parts of the world where we really don't have a clear idea of what might be influencing the systems, to this place we're at now, where there's really tremendous excitement in the industry about being able to offer solutions. There are not a whole lot of solutions to some of the really big problems we have. And amazingly, sort of agroecological approach to farming, potentially we're finding might be able to be part of the answer. And what's really exciting about that is hearing stories from other parts of the world where people have put things into practice which have made a huge difference. But also, I'm currently working on a project with about 20 to 25 of our supplier farmers to measure the health and the carbon content of the soils on about 13,000 acres of land which supplies into Yo Valley. And as well as wanting to understand what's going on underground, it's so motivating and exciting to be talking to the farmers who are also motivated and excited to be part of this solution. So it's really changed and changing the industry at the moment. It's very exciting.
That does sound exciting. And just to clarify, for people, when you're talking about carbon sequestration and carbon in the soils, I don't have this stat to hand, but I wish I did. Soils can store more carbon than the rainforests, and it's got a huge potential to set.
Yeah, there is more carbon in the soil than there is in the atmosphere and in plants combined. There's a huge amount of carbon in the soil. Though a lot of carbon has been lost from soil in the last couple of hundred years, as industrial approaches to working with soil have kind of burnt it up. But really, soil is quite simply made up of minerals, air, water, and what we call organic matter. And organic matter is literally the life in the soil. It's the living things and the decaying things, and that is made up largely of carbon.
Brilliant.
And it is by trying to build more life into the soil that potentially we could draw carbon down from the atmosphere and store it in the soil.
Brilliant. Okay. And thank you for that very practical lesson there. But let's take it back to the philosophical. Kalki, then, for you, what's your motivation?
So for me, I'm highly motivated by the kind of reality of the injustice of climate change. I think that so much of the burden, whether this is like loss of land or irregular water supply, or higher temperatures, more forest fires, or biodiversity loss, so much of the burden of climate change is carried by the global south. And as you know, the reality of climate change is a consequence of the industrialization and the economies and the growth and the wealth of the global north. I think there's a direct relationship between one region's prosperity and the other region's hardship. And I think that this injustice, I think, is easier to understand now. And I think because we understand it, it's important for us to see if it can be reversed. And in addition to that, I really mirror what Tim was saying around how exciting this space is. It's very motivating to wake up every day and think, oh, I'm going to, it's a privilege to work in a sustainable role, to be able to say, my livelihood is potentially going to have a positive impact on, my community and the world. And I think over time, when we look back to the previous decade or the previous 2 centuries, sorry, not decades, it's going to seem absurd what we thought was acceptable, how we lived. I think is going to seem crazy. And
I hope so.
Any business today that isn't learning to adapt to being able to measure their environmental impact, for example, taking account for any externalities caused by their business model, I think they're going to find growing consumer and regulatory pressure, which really encourages them to reverse. So I think that you feel good about what you're doing yourself. It's highly rewarding. I think you're working to correct injustices, and of course I've spoken about social injustices, but of course there's the environmental injustice for wildlife, and the ecosystem. And then in addition to that, I think it's very practical business as well, going into this new decade.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you said, when we are voting with our wallets, when we're spending our money with good businesses, we are, in a very small way, we're supporting people who are doing great work, like all of you. But we're also showing businesses who aren't doing such great work, actually, we are willing to spend our money with the brands that are doing the good things, which hopefully encourages them to change. And you also said something really nice there, which was about the joy this brings you. So because the challenges can seem so huge, and you took us from really big challenges there to the practical everyday. What does bring you the most joy when you're working in this space? And do you always feel like you're making a difference, or does sometimes the problem seem too big? Like, what encourages you to take the small steps when the problem is huge?
So I think if you kind of work for yourself, you're generally somebody who can take a beating, and you're not necessarily someone pursuing joy. So most of my work is me dealing with really difficult things and figuring it out. I think that I really enjoy the thought that there are systems out there, systems of doing business or living that can be within our planetary boundaries and have social and environmental good, positive impact. And I really love the process of coming up with the potential solutions, building those solutions. We've recently built a solution for retailers that are going to enable retailers to recycle the bulk of their products. It's
not just digitally.
Sorry?
I said not just digitally. I was referring back to the
Yes, not just digitally, physically as well. So I think that's really exciting. Innovation, I think, is really exciting. I think it's really human. I think it's one of the most creative things you can do, and it's super rewarding. I feel very privileged to be able to do it. One of like the highlights of my career was we were training women, widows in Ethiopia, northern Ethiopia, to weave. And so we had just finished installing wooden looms in very rural areas, and we were watching the women get trained and learn how to, begin like using these like ancient looms to be able to produce scarves and then increase their income. And I think that direct kind of view of the impact that you're having is really rewarding as well. So that's probably a very big highlight of my career.
Absolutely. What a great highlight. And Lucy, if we can bring it back to food. So, and I guess the question for you would be, how does someone motivate themselves when we're time poor to look at all of the packaging and to choose the maybe whole foods which take a little bit more time to eat? Like, what's the benefits for us? Why should we do that? What can motivate us to do that?
Yeah, gosh, this is such an exciting conversation. I mean, if I maybe just take 30 seconds just to sum up what gut health is, because basically by that, what we mean is we're eating that nutrient-rich food that we talked about from healthy soils. And that in itself is, if we choose that kind of food, we know we are probably supporting farmers and they're getting greater returns because we're perhaps moving away from a complicated food supply chain and processed foods. But by eating those very natural foods full of fibre, that feeds the microbes in our gut. And we have that lovely analogy of the many, many millions of microbes in soil and how it's the same within us. Those microbes in digesting that food for us, they give us many, many benefits. They produce chemicals which have a huge impact on our health. So things like everyone's very keen on a strong immunity at the moment. Actually, our immune system, the cells that make it up, 80% of it sit in the wall of our gut, and our microbes that are sitting within that are acting almost like a vaccine. They're sort of training our immune system to recognize when it needs to react to something it needs to react to, but when it doesn't need to. So our microbes make sure that our immune system is really well controlled. So obviously we're all wanting to have a strong immune system as we can, particularly over the winter. That's one really big benefit of gut health. But to be honest, the fabulous science that we have now shows us that our microbes are involved in protecting us against cancer. They have a big anti-inflammatory role within our body. So they produce chemicals which can give us protection against bowel cancer and other sorts of inflammatory bowel disease, heart health, type 2 diabetes, even weight control, because they're required to make one of our hormones that suppresses our appetite. So they are playing a huge part in our health. And as this research comes through, it's going to become the future of medicine for sure. So for me, the joy of my job is that so much around gut health is connecting us back to nature. It's connecting, it's thinking, as Tom said, what soil did that food grow in? Is it organic even? That's a whole other subject for conversation. But is it nutrient-rich food that's been grown not too far away from where I live, or at least not processed? It's helping my gut health. My gut health is helping my overall health. But in making these choices, you also know that you're part of something so much bigger. You're healing our environment by supporting regenerative farming. It's a huge, the analogy I love is to think of yourself as an ecosystem. So, Tom's talked about our environment and how important it is to have all those microbes in the soil, farming with nature that does that. Well, we ourselves, we are actually, each one of us, more bacteria than we are human. We have many, many more bacteria cells in us than we do our own body cells. So we have to think of ourselves as an ecosystem. And I guess that's the bigger picture, and it's it's why I love sharing so much information around gut health, because it's a huge topic.
It is a huge topic that we should talk about more. But I think I should ask one last question from me, and then we can hand over to the audience, because I understand there's lots of questions coming in, which is great. So I guess, my last question, and Tom, I'm going to ask you to lead with this one. Many people watching this will be wondering, what can I do? What are the small, positive, restorative acts that will make the biggest difference in 2022? We've discussed a lot already. What's the one tip that you would leave us with?
Well, I suppose I'll just try and reinforce what I've tried to tell you about already, and I hope that Lucy's going to really back me up with saying go for the organic regenerative food when you come to her. But I really want to encourage people on the kind of thinking about the soil and the soil ecosystem to maybe try and do something for themselves. If you have some soil, whether it's in a pot or in the garden, there's some really good and simple observations you can do to learn a little bit about whether it's in good health or not. And you don't need to do laboratory tests or anything like that. Things like counting earthworms or looking at the structure of the soil. A really nice healthy soil is one that has the structure a bit like a chocolate cake, and which has lots of little pockets and pores and surfaces. And you can walk out into your garden and you can see, once you slightly change what you're looking for, quite quickly what sort of condition the soil's in, and you can affect that by looking at enhancing that life in the ecosystem with things like compost, and playing around with composting, and that's again able to utilize food waste potentially that way and have a double positive impact. And even if you're as small as working with a pot or a window box, you can make a wormery in a very small container, and there's a wonderful video of me doing it on the Yeo Valley website if anyone wants to look at that. But you can really
checking that out.
See the soil ecosystem happening, and I think if we're all going to change our mindset slightly in 2022 to consider soil more, that could be quite a nice way to get involved.
Brilliant. I'm still pushing for a wormery in our flat, but as yet no success. Soon though. Lucy, what's the one tip you'll leave people with?
I think my big tip would be to think of yourselves as we are living as a part of nature. We are nature ourselves, and so rather than living apart from it, think of ourselves as being a part of nature. And so therefore moving away from ultra processed foods, finding as much fibre for your diet as possible, because that means you're eating natural food, plenty of colourful fruit and veg, and beans and pulses, and less and better meat that we talked about earlier. Just remember that plant-based doesn't mean we have to avoid those other products altogether, because that way you are getting that really rounded, balanced, nutrient-rich diet. And check the labels.
Check the labels. Brilliant. And finally, Calcutta. Last word goes to you.
Got me thinking about my garden. I think that actually what we should recognise is we're not all in the same place. We can't all have exactly the same levels of impact, and we're not all making this equivalent, levels of carbon, creation either. And so my kind of advice would be to really think about what your role is in creating climate change and, challenging climate change. So, what are your privileges? What is your wealth strata? What time do you have? What your networks are like? What influence you can have in your role? What influence you can have in your community? And if you find yourself to be somebody with a lot of leverage, to use that. And if you find yourself to be somebody without that leverage, learn how to speak to your peers so that they may use theirs as well. I think we all can absolutely adapt our own livelihoods. For some, that will come easier than others. And I think it's so important for us to learn to ask those who have more power traditionally within our society to act with that power as well.
Absolutely. And it's a learning curve, and it's a process. It's a journey, right? Nobody's perfect. Not even us, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yet. Okay. Do we have a question coming through? We do. Here we go. So Tom or Lucy, I guess this is for you. How does dairy compare to various alternative milks?
Well, that just makes me sing seeing that question. I think it's so valuable to have events like these to be able to share this sort of information. So really, very quickly, dairy is what we call a food matrix. So it is the best source of calcium that you can choose, because the protein in dairy actually enhances our ability to absorb its calcium. It has, for example, a high level of vitamin B content, which helps us to absorb iron from other foods. Its sugar, lactose, is digested very differently, so it doesn't give us those high spikes. Interestingly, Professor Tim Spector, who some people might know, who's our UK gut health expert at King's College, he did some research recently where he compared the sugar spike that you get in your blood from oat milk compared to or oat drink compared to a dairy milk. And what happened was the sugar went up the same amount, but then in dairy it just stayed nice and steady, whereas in the oat milk it came right back down again. And the reason for that is that there are so many other nutrients within dairy as well, which are just never talked about. One of the ones that I think is the most important is iodine. We're pretty deficient in this country in iodine. A glass of milk will give you half your daily requirements of iodine, and it's really vital during pregnancy to make sure a baby develops correctly. It's very important, obviously, for growth, so our thyroid function. So the difference is huge. I mean, there are obviously people who can't tolerate dairy. In which case, these plant milks form a good alternative. But I would also urge you just to think about the sustainability of that product. So, in making dairy, the cow is just using our natural resource grass. It's using our natural resource of rain to grow the grass. We can't eat grass, but our cows convert it into a highly nutritious food. And that in itself is extremely sustainable because we're using our natural resources.
Yes.
If you compare that to almond milk, where it's produced in California, where they've had, decades of droughts, and yet almond milk requires so much water to produce it. So I'm a huge dairy advocate, and that's the reason why it's an extremely healthy food.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying, if I can jump in, that, and Lucy's done an amazing job of comparing them, nutritionally, but I don't think they really compare. They are quite different things, and there are some quite kind of broad and sweeping international sort of figures which are thrown around about the differences in the sustainability and the impact of these producing these different things. But I think, just to address that slightly, it's worth considering that dairy milk, with all the nutritional benefits that Lucy is describing, is also very different in terms of its impact depending on where it's going on in the world. And as Lucy was saying, in this part of the world, in the UK, it's a very ancient industry, and it really utilises our natural resource. And in terms of environmental impact, we are learning as we start to try to unpick soil health and the movement of nutrients and carbon in and out of the soil, and the effect of different farming practices on biodiversity, that we really don't have the full picture on how these different production systems might impact. But we know that in the UK, we can deliver lots of really great environmental benefits off the back of producing milk from a perennial system, from grasses which grow year to year, which to a very large degree is how organic milk is produced in the UK, against the alternative milks, which generally use annual crops, oats and soy and things like that, which require quite different impacts on the soil to grow them. I think comparison is very, very difficult because they're almost not comparable things.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you both. Really interesting. Can we go to the next question? Thank you. Okay. Lucy, this one's definitely for you. How can I choose foods that are better for my gut health?
Yeah, so I talked about fibre-rich foods, so that's all your fruit and veg and beans and pulses, even nuts and seeds, and keep the skin on as well for extra fibre. I haven't also mentioned food that is naturally probiotic, so it has those live bacteria in it. And it's really interesting, if I go back to a comment that Kalkazan made quite earlier on, thinking about developing countries, what we know is people in less developed countries have fabulous gut health because they're not eating industrialized food. We've really sterilized our food in the West, and we need to get away from that. So we need to start loving our microbes again. I think we were chatting earlier that just one apple has 1,000 microbes in it. So if you go on to ferment that food and help those microbes to multiply and eat it, then that food is a natural probiotic. So, for example, BioLive yogurt. Obviously, I'm gonna recommend that one. If you want to take it one stage further, then kefir is a fermented milk drink, which is just brimming with microbes, and there's good research now to show that those microbes actually reach our large intestine where they need to. Because one question I'm often asked is, what's the difference between a probiotic food, a food that's rich in microbes, and a probiotic supplement? And again, if we look at yogurt, the live bacteria and yeasts that are so beneficial to us, they're in the food, and actually those nutrients in the food protect the bacteria as they pass through our digestive system. So they actually hopefully do get to where they need to, and manage to pass through the harsh environment of our acidic stomach and that sort of thing. Whereas a probiotic supplement, it's just obviously the pure liquid form with bacteria in it with no protection. And whereas there are some probiotics that probably are beneficial, far better just to get it from our food.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
Fermented food and fibre-rich food is the way to look after our gut health.
Brilliant.
And actually,
Thank you.
very quickly, cheese. Can I just shout out for cheese? People think about cheese as a Christmas treat, or mustn't eat too much cheese, but cheese is also naturally fermented probiotic food.
Any cheese?
Well, particularly mature cheese, so the longer it's been matured, the better. But it's basically just preserved milk. It's how in years gone by we used to be able to enjoy milk in the winter because we had it preserved in cheese. So yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Please, could we have the next question? Okay. And how does animal welfare fit into a sustainable food supply? Who'd like to take this one?
Well,
Tom,
that's
probably.
a tricky one. And I think, I don't know, I think by anyone's assessment, a system which doesn't take animal welfare into consideration probably isn't sustainable over the long run. We know that animals which are kept in conditions which are not good for their welfare ultimately are going to impact the productivity of that system, the health of that system, the use of drugs and the need for the use of extra chemical kind of tools which aren't open to us in organic agriculture, often are needed in much higher amounts in systems which are lower animal welfare. And so I think the direct link between animal welfare and sustainability is not that clear, but animal welfare is incredibly important. And really, if we're trying to build the ultimate long-term systems for the future, then animal welfare has to be a pillar within that.
Absolutely. Kalkatang, do you have anything to add to that? Because also, obviously, animals in the fashion supply chains. how does animal welfare fit into that?
Yeah, I think so. I would like raise my hand and say I'm not like a full expert in this space, but from what I do know, so if you think about the production of wool, for example, there are scales to it. So there's huge industrial wool production, which puts the sheep at, damages them, cuts them, makes them less healthy, creates a life of suffering for them. And then there's micro scale wool production, which is muslin free, which is much less likely to cause harm to the animal, and much less kind of intensive as well. So from sitting from a perspective of, without the experience of animal husbandry, I would say that what's important is that the scale is manageable to the natural capacity of the animal. And if it's not, then I think it'd be really easy to exploit the animal. But yes, this is probably something that I too would ask and hopefully learn about too. So thank you, Tom.
Sure. Brilliant. Does anyone have anything else to add, or should we move on to the next question? Lucy, please do.
Yeah, just very quickly, I always think it's really interesting to understand that cattle and many grazing animals also have a much more developed gut microbiome than we do ourselves. So if you imagine, I'm just going to imagine a cow because we're being hosted by Year Valley, but the more natural their diet and their lifestyle that mirrors how it would have been for them or how it should be for their biology, then that really nurtures their own microbiome, which means that they are then, fertilizing the soil better and improving the health of that soil, and they're producing healthier food for us. And we, our livestock and our farming all then just become part of this wonderful sort of circular system for what I like to say planetary health. So I just think it's always great just to think, it's not our own gut health we need to think about. It's our animals too. And also we know from some research that when they have a really optimum microbiome, then actually they're producing less methane. So it's really win-win.
Excellent. That's really good to hear. Thank you. Could we please have the next question? How important is grass in carbon capture? Tom, this is your name all over it.
This is a huge topic for us, and really very interesting, though I would say still in a science in its infancy. It comes back again to the soil ecosystem, which we've touched a little bit on, and what's quite interesting about this whole area is that some of the breakthroughs in soil science have only happened in the last 10 or 20 years, and we really know less about what's going on down there than we know about deep space and the oceans, which is kind of amazing. But the grass's role in carbon capture, we're experimenting with and we're coming to understand is really key. Some of the deepest soils in the world with the highest levels of carbon stored in them developed under grassland ecosystems. And the way that grass can foster or move carbon from the atmosphere into the soil is quite simple. I mean, lots of people would have learned the process of photosynthesis at school, where we know that green plants are able to capture carbon from the atmosphere and turn it into sugar for energy. And at least in my schooling, the process kind of came to an end there. We didn't think much about what the plant doesn't move, so it doesn't need loads of energy, is not made of sugar. What does it do with it? And we're coming to understand that in the amazing world of the soil food web, grasses, other plants as well, but grasses particularly, invest a lot of the carbon which they capture and turn into sugar into the relationships that it has in the soil with the microbes that live around its roots. It quite literally will pass the sugars, which are carbon effectively, from the atmosphere through its body and out into the soil. And this is the primary production of all of the energy which goes into the soil food web, everything which is living underground, and as I've described, holding more carbon than there is in the atmosphere and in the plants combined, all of that came by a couple of routes. One, as most people would understand, is decomposition. So organic matter falls onto the surface of the soil and is incorporated by earthworms or microbes or whatever. But the other one, the one which is really exciting for grassland, which we're just learning about, is this idea of liquid carbon flow, of the sugars from the grass flowing out through the roots and really, feeding the life in the soil. And that is the way in which it's believed, and which we are starting to experiment with and understand, is why grass is so important for carbon capture.
Incredible. And just really quickly, the longer the grass, the more carbon in the soil, or we're not sure about that yet? But yeah.
I mean, tall grass obviously has more leaf on it, and more area for sunlight to strike and be turned into sugar. And grass tends to grow in such a way that there's as much above as below. And so as you let your grasses grow taller, you let it also put its roots down further and to interact with deeper layers of the soil. And it's thought that perhaps putting carbon into deeper layers of the soil might lock it up for longer than putting carbon into the top few centimeters of soil. So this is a kind of a new area of investigation. It's one we've been experimenting with last year on some beef cattle that we have, on letting the grass grow really, really long and then letting them eat it and see how much the cows like it and what the effect on the wildlife is, and how much. And later on, we'll test the soils again to see what the impact has been on underground carbon. But yeah, the height of the grass is quite an interesting topic.
Brilliant. And is that something that we could translate to anyone that's fortunate enough to have their own gardens? Like, should we be letting our grass grow longer, or is this
I would say that there's that you might have heard of an initiative called No Mow May, which is promoted by Plant Life, and that is really and it's effectively for the month of May, you don't mow your lawn, you let it grow as long and as wild as it wants to. And they're really interested in plant species and biodiversity. And I haven't looked into any of the figures particularly, but I did notice that they have started to talk about that it might have an effect on carbon as well. So it could be a very interesting thing for people to experiment with. I've done it for a few years on my lawn, and I've not measured the carbon in my lawn, but I have noticed that the species mixture and the number of flowers and things that we have has changed. So it's having an effect, at least on the above ground ecosystem.
Okay, brilliant. Maybe you could measure your soil and get back to us in a couple of years. And then we can all be part of the solution. Great. Next question, please. Thank you. Okay. And Kalkidan, this looks like it might be one for you. Do you think developing a kite mark for fashion to show that the eco credentials have been checked and stand up, similar to the fair trade mark for food, is needed?
Absolutely. I mean, there are companies who offer different levels of transparency to the eco credentials, but of course nothing like standardized across the entire industry. So yes, absolutely. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the fashion supply uses 30% of the land that's used for agriculture. It's impacting every industry, and it's treated a bit frivolously, as though it's not doing that. And I think it's because, for lots of different reasons, but I think people distance themselves from fashion. We're all dressed, we're all adorned, and despite that, I think people don't quite include it in their decision making around whether or not their shopping is having an impact. So I think this would be a great start. There is changing regulations. So starting this year, companies that are listed, public companies, will have to publish and explain their net zero strategies, which will include their ability to kind of really describe the eco credentials and the provenance of their products. So I think over the next few years we'll see that. But in addition to this, I'll go a step further and say It's not enough for fashion to understand its supply chain. It also needs to understand what happens to products at the end of their life. In the UK, we send 350 tons of clothing into landfill each year, and that's only like a small proportion of the clothing waste we generate. It is often put in environments where it will destroy the local ecosystem. When it's exported, it's often dumped in the sea, so it often destroys marine habitats.
Wow.
And the reason this fashion is being produced is because a company, a retailer, a brand has decided that's their business model and they're going to generate profit from it. But as they do, they're causing a lot of environmental harm elsewhere. So it is a step, but I think what's really important is that brands can describe to consumers where an item originates, how it should be used, and where it ends up. And I think this is for fashion, but really any non-perishable consumer good brand. Yeah, and I think that's the future as well. I hope we're playing a part in Schwab in finding that future, but I think that's what's going to happen.
Brilliant. And just to develop that question a little bit, are there any eco-credentials at the moment, or I can't think of the other word that I'm looking for. Are there any credentials available at the moment that people can look out for?
So the thing that I think is most similar to what's being described in this question is actually being piloted by a company called NAS Fashion, and they've developed it's essentially like a labeling system for clothing, which looks at material use, labour in production. Mm-hmm. And so I point people to NAS Fashion, and then
how are we spelling that?
What I'll do is I'll post. Sorry. NAZ.
Yes, how do you spell
NAZ?
NAZ. NAZ Fashion. Okay.
Yeah. But look, I can put together a host of resources and publish it on our Schwab page as well. So it's really nice and clear later on.
Amazing. Thank you. And that would be schwab.co.uk.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you. Could we have the next question, please? Unless Tom or Lucy would like to expand on that.
No.
Are there any regenerative farming practices which are easy to apply to growing at home? Tom, so we can no mow may.
No mow mays, yeah, really good one. So the principles of regenerative farming, which are generally agreed on, are to incorporate livestock, to grow diversity, to keep a living root in the soil all year round, to provide that flow of liquid sugars, as I was describing, to protect the soil surface from the elements, and what is the last one? Integrate livestock, maximize diversity, armor the soil, living root, and reduce disturbance of the soil as much as you can. And to a greater or lesser extent, it might not be that viable to bring livestock into your home garden, though perhaps chickens or something could be used. But the other ones you can use, and you can kind of see what they're all getting at. If you start to see the soil as a very delicate web of ecology, then you can understand how disturbing it or allowing it to become waterlogged or to be baked by the sun is not going to really be very positive for it. And so there's a quite well established approach to horticulture called no dig, where they grow vegetables and things using very little soil disturbance and protecting the soil and channeling a lot of those kind of practices. And I suppose the other thing is the idea of diversity, how, mostly in nature and when we think about regenerative farming, often we're trying to mimic natural systems. You do not come across monocultures of single species, and most people's lawns are exactly that. They are, very heavily cropped and mowed and compacted monocultures, which is not peak performance for soil health. And so thinking about how you can incorporate perhaps different species, which are going to grow
different
at
grass species.
Different grass species, but also there are low-growing flower species, clovers and things like that. People will often have in their lawns, which can flower, which can provide a bit of nectar for pollinators, but also we'll be working with different communities of organisms in the soil and kind of just increasing the overall diversity of the ecosystem.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And I can actually just see that we've run over time. So that was our last question. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us today and for all of your questions. Of course, thank you to our panelists and to Yo Valley Organic for hosting. This has been such an enlightening conversation. So thank you again. And I hope that everyone is taking away some helpful insights on how to shop, live and eat sustainably. Until next time.
Thanks very much.